Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back. And if you're not back, you're naughty. It's a privilege to welcome David to talk to us. We know a fair bit about David now, so but the fact that he works is the Toowoomba diocese, isn't it? Is it an archdiocese? No. Toowoomba diocese in Queensland. He's the social justice commissioner for that diocese, and he's going to talk to us on reflecting on colonial violence and how we get healing for ourselves, because we're the perpetrators, aren't we? I couldn't help but notice that this morning this afternoon when after Ray left, I felt like saying, no, this is the white mob. Because that's what we are. Okay, here's David now. Thank you, David. Welcome.
Thank you, Gary. Everyone can hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. In the third week in August 1770, Lieutenant James Cook, having concluded that no European had ever seen this continent's east coast, hoisted the English colours, and in the evening light took possession of this country in His Majesty's name, together with all of the bays, harbours, rivers and islands situated along the coast. Cook's audacious act enabled the British Colonial Office to make the extraordinary claim of half the continent, claiming these lands as property of the Crown. This expropriation of about 400 million hectares of land was an act of theft on a truly heroic scale. They're the words of Henry Reynolds. Not yet. Oh yes, this is me learning. About 130 years later, the United Kingdom's Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour authored a public statement in favour of the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, dated November 2nd, 1917. Balfour informed Lord Rothschild, a leader of the British Jewish community, that His Majesty's government will use the best endeavours, that's the phrase, best endeavours, to facilitate the achievement of this national homeland. Yet the United Kingdom had already agreed to honour Arab independence aspirations. The High Commissioner to Egypt, Henry McMahon, had already promised the Sharif of Mecca, Hussein bin Ali, to recognise Arab independence. And that was within the limits and boundaries proposed by Hussein himself, in return for Hussein launching a revolt against the Ottoman Empire. To add to the duplicity, the UK, France and Russia secretly concluded the Sykes-Picot Agreement to divide up the Ottoman Empire. In the 1920 post-war conference at San Remo, and it was later confirmed by the League of Nations, a British mandate for Palestine was created. This mandate incorporated, in the British mind at least, the 1917 Balfour Declaration. And later in 1937, Britain proposed the partition of Palestine. David Ben-Gurion saw this as a stepping stone to full possession of the land. In the 250 years since 1770, the First Nations people of this land, now called Australia, has experienced invasion, massacres, and theft of lands and livelihood. Local people stood their ground to protect country and resisted the invasion by every means available to them. Where I live, and I'm part of the committee organising the commemoration, we have a concrete example of a warrior called Multuggerah defeating the British coming up the range. There's a mountain just outside the escarpment. Many people call it Tabletop Mountain or One Tree Hill. Miwa is its name, and we call it commemoration of the Battle of Miwa, just outside of Toowoomba. It's a battle, it's proof of resistance, but it's also proof that First Nations warriors won a battle. Here in Sydney, you know of Pimmelwood, who led the guerrilla-style war against the colonists, which he did so by burning crops and raiding food stalls, among other things. I'm having difficulty with this. Not only was millions and millions of hectares forcibly taken from First Nations peoples, tens of thousands were killed in so-called frontier wars. The numbers killed can only be estimates, but they range between 20,000 and 60,000. Some of you will know of Professor Lyndall Ryan, who does a massacres historical account, and she talks about 400 separate massacres and believes at least 10,000 First Nations people were killed in those specific 400 massacres. Yeah. We also need to consider ongoing deaths in custody. Ever since the 1991 Royal Commission recommendations, there have been more than 540 deaths in custody. None of these numbers, of course, include deaths because of introduced illnesses like flu and measles and tuberculosis and smallpox. With the British control over Palestine, successive waves of Jewish immigration occurred. There was a rise in nationalist movements on both sides. Violence ensued. As early as 1920, there was conflict with Jewish communities encroaching on Arab lands. Increasing immigration of tens of thousands of European Jews led to an Arab revolt in the years before World War II. Over the 18 months, still before the war started, British troops supported by Jewish auxiliary police suppressed the revolt, leaving about 5,000 Arabs killed and about 15,000 wounded. The Nakba, as Mary has already talked about, did not start or end in 1948. This catastrophe of ethnic cleansing has a long history and continues today. Between 1947 and 1949, at least 750,000 Palestinians from a population of 1.9 million were made refugees. Another 30 to 40,000 were internally displaced within the Israeli state. About 530 villages and cities were destroyed by the Israelis. About 15,000 Palestinians killed in a series of mass atrocities. Zionist forces claimed 78% of the historic Palestine area as their new state. Since 1948, the processes of killings, ethnic cleansings and displacements have not ended. What's happening in Gaza is just horrific. In just this current war, and I think the numbers are greater than this, but it's 40,000 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza in just this current military intervention. The current map of Palestinian territories looks a bit like the Bantustans of apartheid South Africa. And having been to South Africa and lived there for a while and been to the museums, I have seen the maps. And they were created in South Africa to limit and control the black population. So what's happening here? To limit and control the Palestinian population. The West Bank is at 586,000 square kilometres, only about 21% of historic Palestine, but the Palestinian Authority has only full control over 18% of this 21%. Only 18% of this 21%. They have joint control with Israel over another 22%, but Israel has full control over 60% of West Bank. To put the colonial violence that has occurred in what is now called Australia and in Palestine, we need to look at a bigger picture. The bigger picture of British imperial violence. The British Empire was only possible through violence. Both the land called Australia and historic Palestine were invaded directly by British and facilitated by British. With that said, let me focus on the background to the invasion of these lands, Australia, that we now stand, and I do so in the knowledge that this also shaped the later British actions with respect to Palestine. I have a picture there of Caroline Elkins, historian. She's got herself into a lot of trouble, a lot of media controversy, but she sees that the empire was born from conflict. Violence was not just the British Empire's midwife, it was endemic in the structures and the systems of British rule. Violence was a means and an end for as long as the British Empire stayed alive. Elkins reports that during the 19th century, over 250 separate armed conflicts occurred within the British Empire, at least one in every given year. She recalls Boris Johnson, who you will know well, acknowledging that Britain had invaded or conquered 178 countries over the last 200 years. This is British violence, and this is what we have inherited. It's important to note that the level of brutality and violence within Great Britain and Ireland also. Looking at the years before and during the colonial invasion of Australia, I was about to say New Zealand, but that's true too. To offer a glimpse of this brutality, I want to point to some different ways that were used to forcibly move people for the sake of profit. Not only did the British transport about 3.1 million enslaved Africans to its North American and Caribbean colonies, of which only about 2.7 million arrived alive, they also forcibly moved most of the English population off the commons. Most of the peasant, the poor population were forced off the land, off the communal lands of their forebears, that their forebears had had access to for centuries. Over a 300-year period from 1604, over 5,200 separate acts of parliament enclosed 6.8 million acres of land. This forced the poor off the land into newly industrialised cities and towns. But most of these enclosures took place after 1750. And you think of 1770 when James Cook was wandering up and down this coast. And this dynamic is paralleled in Scotland through the Highland clearances and in Ireland with the establishment of the plantation system. To also increase the available labour supply to the industrialising towns, a campaign against the existing poor law was instituted, and this led to the establishment of the 1834 Poor Law Reform. Instead of guaranteed subsistence through cash payments to the elderly, to widows, to poor families with many children, welfare payments were significantly reduced, and people receiving this aid were required to reside in a workhouse overseen by guardians. And there was no payment offered at all for those who were living independently outside of the workhouses, and most able-bodied workers and their families were forced to migrate from rural areas in search of work. The 1718 Transportation Act made forced migration to a penal colony a standard feature of the ordinary criminal justice system, a standard feature. Prior examples exist of Irish opponents to British control being sent to Virginia and various Caribbean islands, but the 1718 Act established transportation as a normal criminal sentence. Approximately 50,000 convicts were transported to the North American colonies and about 162,000 to Australia. 162,000. Law professor Richard Boast draws on research to argue that those who were transported to Australia were simply ordinary British and Irish working class men and women who had for one reason or another got into trouble. These were not habitual criminals who were forced to migrate and permanently severed from their families and all that was familiar to them. And for those that ended up in New South Wales, this lovely town here called Sydney, the brutality continued. As Boast names that New South Wales stood out as highly militarised and authoritarian, the colony was run by a coercive regime with a legal system staffed only by amateurs. Alongside these forced migrations sits an English history of rural and urban riots. They weren't a good lot at all. They weren't behaving. Part of London's political tradition was the propensity of the lower orders, is what's been quoted here, but the poorer classes, to use public demonstrations to interfere with political decision making. We might say that's a good thing. They focused on Parliament as it represented the country's political elites, and at one point in 1780, the riots caused law and order to break down for days on end in London. This glimpse of 18th and 19th century British reality of brutality and of violence seeks to point to the experience that shaped those who came to Australia, shaped those who came and colonised Australia. I claim, and this is just from my own reading, those who came, the British and Irish came as convicts and so-called settlers. They brought with them generations of unresolved trauma, and I dare to name that the invading culture has been shaped by unhealed collective wounds, unprocessed collective pain, unresolved ongoing collective trauma. And we'll talk about that now. Some of you will know that this is an area I've been doing a bit of research in, and I've spoken about some of this in the past. But we all know something about the reality of trauma. Most basically, Bessel van der Kolk describes trauma as an evolutionary protective response to highly stressful events. Trauma is the woundedness that develops when we are pushed beyond our normal limits. This woundedness does not only reside in our brains and our nervous systems, but in our whole bodies. Trauma changes us. It distorts our ability to process memories clearly, and it makes us more reactive to future stress. It's even possible to unintentionally harm or oppress others without even being aware of it. Facing our trauma and seeking healing does not happen very easily. We are often unwilling to face our woundedness, if in fact we even recognise it's there in the first place. So, if it's not faced, we are destined to carry the trauma, pain into the future. Our unresolved, unhealed trauma shapes us to the extent that we can only see reality through the pain of our trauma. This restricts our choices. We carry all that we have denied, disowned, dissociated, and suppressed into the future. Not only do we carry our trauma in our entire bodies, but we hold it also in our cultures and our social institutions. Gabor Mate understands that trauma is never purely an individual problem. Thomas Hubel, that's the book on screen there, sees that individual trauma must be seen in the context of social trauma. He sees that the symptoms of collective trauma appear to reveal themselves in the condition of collective bodies of all kinds. Our communities, our schools, organisations, institutions, governments, environments, all of these reveal where we are injured, fractured, or imbalanced. And my basic argument is that the brutality and violence of the home country, the invasion of Australia, and the facilitating of the invasion of Palestine are symptoms of this unresolved collective trauma. These symptoms also contributed to further traumatizing experiences. I'm quite sure that when colonists arrived here from Botany Bay in the early 1800s, the environment traumatized them. This was so different from what they were used to. What is required is to uncover some of the actual causes of this collective trauma, so then we can face it and maybe we can do a process around healing. You might have caught the news last week. Michaela Cronin, the Domestic Family and Sexual Violence Commissioner, released her progress report on the National 10-Year Plan. She talks of the needs of systems changes, plural, systems changes, and that there are no easy fixes. To my mind, domestic violence and the historical and ongoing colonial violence are parallel symptoms. I will follow carefully the systems changes that Michaela seeks to name. Underpinning these systems from my own research, I want to name 4 contributing factors that I see are interconnected and intertwined. Colonizers and their descendants are formed by the so-called enlightened worldview, by an ideology and experience of empire, by a growing self-identity based on a sense of superiority to those who are not white, and by punitive, dominant Christian theologies. Any of us who were brought up in schools that were staffed by Catholics who were of Irish background particularly will know the level of discipline that we got. People of the British Isles, but particularly the dominant English, were profoundly impacted by the Enlightenment way of thinking and organising life. They became convinced that they now knew the secret of knowledge and therefore the secret of mastering the world. Greek dualism, scientific logic, and the elimination of God from the public arena led to the assumption that the physical world could be occupied, manipulated, and exploited. Enlightenment thinking also contributed to the origins of the science of economics, the legitimation of the modern capitalist cycle of production and consumption, and with the removal of the divine imperatives, economics was freed from the requirements of justice and the dangers of covetousness. It was the Enlightenment that also led to rapid Western imperial expansion. This always involved the use of force. It enabled the colonizer to become an illegitimate, privileged usurper. I was reading David Marr's book recently, and a number of the quotes used the word usurper in it. You think of the power of that word, the implications of that word. Who not only took Indigenous lands and their bounty, but also Indigenous lives, identity, well-being and labour. Thus for colonisers and their descendants, empire, exploitation and becoming a usurper of others became a normative mindset. To create an empire, the British needed to legitimate their invasions and thefts. A justification evolved, arguing that they had responsibility to civilise those deemed as barbarians. Those who were not European were seen as different and inferior. Racism became a consubstantial part of the colonial dynamic. The fourth interconnected factor, punitive Christian theologies. What is critical is the God imaging that theology offers. An Israeli academic, Yochai Ataria, believes that the story of Abraham binding Isaac for sacrifice has been very formative for the Western culture. He argues that we have been formed to appease a bloodthirsty God who keeps count and punishes wrongdoers. He knows that we become like the God we adore. Each of these four interconnected formative factors, enlightenment, empire, superiority, and punitive theologies, I believe have contributed to the collective trauma of the British colonial perpetrator. These factors have shaped the invasions of this land now called Australia, and the British facilitated Jewish invasion of Palestine. The reality of trauma, the reality of our historical denial, disavowal, disassociation and suppression has its roots in a long history of disconnections. And I think the key word that comes out of psychology is disconnections and the implications of that. The English and their forebears, whether they were Anglo or Saxon or Jute or Norse or Norman, were part of a longer history of migration, invasion, violence and disconnection. Yet after centuries of relative stability, the so-called modern era brought new disconnection. Experiences of enlightenment, empire, superiority and punitive theologies have led to people disconnected from land and place, from family, community and ancestors, from history, story and identity, disconnected from their own selves, from their own bodies, their emotions, their spiritualities, and their ability to show compassion and empathy. These formative experiences have disconnected the colonizers and their descendants from a true openness to the God of Jesus, an openness to uncovering historical injustices, and an openness to right relationships with the rest of creation. These disconnections have contributed to the white fella trauma wound, and these need to be faced so that healing is possible. It is necessary to address the perpetrators of colonisation and their descendants. Some of you will know of Australian academic Claire Land and her exploring how we decolonise solidarity. And she claims that some work can be done from within the oppressor camp. She calls for the development of a critical self-reflection so that acting politically in solidarity with First Nations peoples can be possible. She calls for the development of a critical self-reflection. And that's our journey, I think. US social ethicist Mary Elizabeth Hobgood goes a step further and argues that the most profound and radical politics comes out of our own self-identity. She hopes that we have an obligation to work for our own liberation. Hobgood is suspicious of altruism, for it's only when authentic self-love exists can other love be possible, and the basis for genuine solidarity be present. Descendants of perpetrators of violence and invasion need to see that seeking healing is an act of self-love, and it is a commitment to working for our own liberation. A healing that is liberative requires an openness to spiritualities that connect us to one another and to the wider world. Gabor Mate, who I mentioned earlier, understands that trauma is the antithesis of spirituality. So being open to spiritualities that connect us needs to be at the heart of any trauma healing process. I met John Sabrino in Nairobi at one stage, listened to him and got to speak to him afterwards. He names that the basic building blocks of a spirituality that's both liberative and connecting. He speaks about honesty about the real, fidelity to the real, and being willing to be swept along by the more of reality. Not running away from reality, not denying reality, but facing it honestly. In the context of the denials, disavowals, disassociations, and suppressions that flow from unhealed trauma, Sabrino's insights call for a lifelong journey where connection to reality is healing and healing is real connection. Speaking of spiritual growth, South African theologian Albert Nolan offers ways that contribute to this journey of connection. Nolan calls us to be amongst those who are poor, in the hope that we grow in compassion. Through our immediate contact with them and our learning about their contexts. He hopes that through this process we come to see the bigger structural problem and that we come to feel the anger that God must feel because of this. Nolan hopes we learn humility when we realise that those who are poor do not need us. From this new humility, he hopes that we can also learn true solidarity. Spiritual growth for the beneficiaries of injustice requires connection to real people in real contexts of injustice. Like Albert Nolan, I'm talking about hope. I'm talking about hope for healing for those who are perpetrators of violence and invasion and for their descendants, and I'm one of those. I'm talking about hope for connection, compassion and empathy. Van der Kolk, Mate and Hubel help us name what collective trauma that we carry. I point to the Enlightenment, empire, superiority and punitive theologies that possibly has contributed to this trauma. Land and Hobgood call us to act for our own healing Sabrino and Nolan offer insights and concrete actions that are about healing disconnection so that liberation and true solidarity are possible. I can't speak about the context for the Israelis, but I can speak for those who have descended from the British Empire. People who are English, people who are Irish, people who are Australian, people who are New Zealand. We have been formed by the same Anglo-Celtic cultural and historical dynamic. I need there to be hope because I need there to be a way for perpetrators and their descendants like me to change and for healing and true solidarity to emerge. Thank you.
The questions.
Claude was going to throw something, I think, weren't you, Claude? You asked me whether I had a crash helmet on.
You said what happened in the past, and I said you might need one tonight.
I won't need one, thank you. I missed out the first word.
Anyone like to ask questions or comment?
I suggest, Gary, that we have some time for reflection.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to have that anyway. But just anyone just immediately would like to.
Thanks, Gary. Thank you, David. I don't want this to be a red herring, but there's a lot of people, most mental health patients have experienced trauma. Can you hear me? This on? And so I was wondering whether you see the connection between collective, if that is a part of that as well.
I'd rather see the parallel between the perpetrators of domestic violence and the court psychologist reports that follow that talk about the huge percentage of perpetrators of domestic violence having unresolved trauma and seeing the parallel with that. I can't talk about mental health issues. I haven't done the studies around that.
Well, the program now is to go to your groups, but you might like to spend some time on reflection first, and then about 3:15 we're going to have afternoon tea, and then after that we have an open session again. So the program is now, we keep to the program, is to go to your group again and talk about hope, and might get David to put some of the slides back on so you can see some of the ideas.
Gary, any slides in particular?
Just start from the beginning, yeah. Just the word ones if you can.
The white parts of the map of places Britain never invaded.
Oh.
Okay, you see the white bits?
No, I just want to go back to the one, you know, that one and the colours, and explain the areas.
There's a code up here, and Mary, you'd probably know it better than I. But this is the 60% that's controlled entirely by the Israelis. And then you've got the small areas that those two are not very well distinguished in the colouring there, but probably that area is joint, and then this area is only by Palestinian Authority, or is it the other way around? What do you think, Mary?
Area A is Palestinian.
Yeah, and so is that the darker blue? Yeah.
Mary, given what you said about the colour orange, shouldn't the colours be the other way around?
This was just a map that I found, colour wise.
The map maker needs to listen to
Well,
Mary.
yes.
Well, I guess, you know, the colors will change pretty soon because what we know is that there's a lot more illegal settlements that are actually encroaching onto those areas. So, you know, all of these areas will actually soon be decreasing, and you'll have more of Israeli areas where they are protected.
I was thinking of the orchids, the orange orchids. The colour that you talked about, you know. You know, when you talked about the orange orchids.
Oh, the orange,
Orchards,
the oranges. the
growing
Jaffa
oranges.
Orchards.
Yeah,
Yeah, I was thinking of the,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah,
the symbolism of the orange.
right. No, it's not. I mean, Jaffa is on the coast,
Oh,
but that's the West Bank. And then the Gaza Strip is obviously that small bit, but all of that is actually the West Bank, which, you know, under UN, that's meant to be Palestinian territories. However, as you can see, it's completely occupied, well, almost completely occupied by Israeli military.
I still find it.
Which means like with,
This is
say,
not
Gaza, you know, there's limitations in terms of movement. When we talk about apartheid, you know, there's restrictions and hundreds of checkpoints within
Wasn't-
all of these
wasn't going.
areas.
oh, it is now. It must be because it's sort of.
And so it, you know, that freedom
Does
of
it have to
movement
be
is not
directed so
there.
it sees that?
Just so you can hear what it's saying.
It's Wi-Fi, isn't it? Yeah.
And with, obviously in terms of the Gaza Strip, you know, although, obviously there's no military or there's no Israeli military inside. This was before the 7th of October. It's actually a blockade. It's pretty much an open concentration camp. They can't bring anything in or out. They don't have control over the land or the sea or the water or the electricity. Not sure if at the start of all of this, you've heard Israeli ministers say, we're going to block electricity, block the water. So they have control over that whole strip and they can do anything they want, even though there's no presence inside, but from the outside, they have control over that area, over the 2 million people that are living in there. They can't actually build houses or things like that. Everything needs a permit in terms of bringing those, you know, building supplies. So it's pretty hard. Very similar to the West Bank as well. And all the, lots of settlements, new settlements coming in.
Carry on.
Yes. Some of, yeah.
Closure of the commons, pushing people off the land. Poor houses, workhouses. Riots. There was a whole story I read about parades of carriages being attacked just before parliamentary votes.
Let's just read through that for us.
Collective trauma, an evolutionary protective response mechanism, a whole body woundedness. It changes us, distorts our memories, makes us more reactive. Need to face so that we don't carry it into the future. And those are the three main sources, and the one in the middle is the one that I've most enjoyed. most been challenged by, but most found answers in. Because it's about collective.
It just strikes me that our, how much we need to focus on our history, on histories. I'm afraid I didn't know anything about all of the events. The events up to in the 19th century that were related to Palestine and the British involvement in, I just feel so, unknowing, basically, because of not knowing that history. I suppose.
David?
It's a bit along those lines too, but I'm kind of aghast that people could have been shoved out of their homes and other people took over their homes. And when I think about that, it's gone on and on and on and on in different cultures. And we're standing by. I'm speechless in a way. I'm surrounded too by people who say that was all in the past. We've got to get on with it now. But you can't get on with it unless you admit that this has happened.
I think you're experiencing that woundedness, because I feel the same. I go to the Palestinian marches because I don't know what else to do. And someone says, one brother asked me, "Why do you go?" I said, "I go there and I pray." And he said, "Do you say the rosary?" I said, "No, I just go there to pray, to march with them and pray for the people." Can we just go back one? Just go back one slide. Like that whole body woundedness. I think that's I think that's the expression what you were saying. I think that's how I think it's expressed. I might be wrong, but
Tony.
I think Katrina led into my question.
Yeah.
Is there any example of a perpetrator admitting what they've done and wanting to change things?
In the domestic violence arena, no, just
The national
let me talk about this to start with. There's been a whole lot of processes around, and it's some of it's ended up in what you call restorative justice processes. But there's so much is required for that journeying, because you've really got to actually admit what you've actually done, and the magnitude of that. Now, at the national levels, the British still aren't admitting, though there was an apology officially from King Charles to Kenya to do with the way the Mau Mau how the British actually treated the Mau Mau because of the uprising. But there were only a few of the actual people who were still alive, of the ones who'd been imprisoned, and there was only a few that had to be compensated. But it's a bit like the Catholic Church. We're apologising for what happened in residential schools, but there's still a bigger picture that the residential schools were part of. And so in some ways the same with like Kenya and the Kikuyu who were put in concentration camps during the Mau Mau rebellion. The apologies only for this narrow bit and making sure we don't actually have to pay compensation.
And only when it rises to the surface.
Well, because there's no choice, it's in your face. Yeah, yeah.
Go back to that slide you just had, David. That collective trauma looks to me like this, it looks like the 12-step program for individuals. So the trauma, like for people are, you know, addicted, and we're all addicted in some sort, but came to believe a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. You know, that 12-step program is dealing with the trauma of addicts who've got to a stage where they're out of control and can't govern their lives. So how do we translate that to the collective, recognising the collective? Because that's really what it is, isn't it? It's that collection of addiction to this kind of power and control.
One of the interesting journeys would be to reflect on dominant Australian culture and just to think, what are the fundamental denials in that? What are the things that the culture doesn't want to go near? One of them is that, yes, we want a lifestyle and getting ahead and all of that. And there's this difficult thing around fossil fuels at the moment, because some of them still want it because we need the money from it. Whereas, you know, the challenge of, oh yes, we can go to solar, but we don't want to change our lifestyles. The lifestyles are sacrosanct. And to think that most Australians are within the top 1% of the world's wealthy, and their lifestyles are reflective of that. We don't want to worry about the rest of the world.
So underpinning all that though is a spirituality, because there's a spirituality that underpins the 12-step program.
Yep.
So it's a spiritual disease. It's got, Pope Francis names it.
And what sort of spirituality are we offering the rest of the country? That's the challenge. Okay. So basically saying it's there's a bigger picture that we're part of, and anybody who's done cultural anthropology understands the impact of the collective on the individual, and sometimes the individual on the collective.
What's the name of that book, David, on the left-hand side there?
This one here, Structural Trauma of Western Culture. And then the subtitle is Towards the End of Humanity. This is the Israeli academic that I quoted. Basically, this slide is really about trying to say our disconnections, trying to name some of the disconnections that we've got. And maybe they've been in our culture for hundreds of years. But, you know, the fact that we can just sell up a piece of land and say we move on, you know, and you think of what First Nations peoples for 60, 65,000 years have said, that this is country, it's inalienable. But we've got the thing that we've commodified and we can walk away from it. And the fact that I went to South Africa, but also came here. My family's all in Aotearoa. You know, I've moved away from my family. I can't see them on a regular basis. I've got 2 grandchildren just half an hour's drive from where Mike and Liz live.
Okay.
And I've met one of them, but the new one I haven't yet. There's a disconnection, fundamental disconnection in modern Western cultures and if you want to use the phrase white fella Australian culture. There's a fundamental disconnection we have to do work on.
What kind of work?
A lot.
Can I just make a comment when we're talking about the colonisers? I'm probably using my teacher voice, I don't need it. The people who came here were, as in the colonisers, from my readings, they were disconnected. They didn't really want to be here. They were taken away from their families and their lives. They went through incredible trauma. I'm not making excuses, but there couldn't have been a worse group of people to have here. And what they did was so stupid and ignorant and violent because they didn't know what else to do. And communication from the important people was useless and took forever. So I just think all these things were just a mix of disaster because they didn't know what they were dealing with. They didn't know what they were coming to. They had no cultural understanding. So it's a huge issue, isn't it, in terms of what we've done
Yep.
and why we did it. I don't think it was ever going to work out any better. And from the moment it started, it was a disaster.
Agree with every word. I just want to add one extra
Please.
line. And the extra line is, when Australia became independent from Britain, did the white fellas go home?
No.
Colonisation continues. And we are party to it.
Yeah, I think I want to challenge a bit this business of, traumatized people setting the tone for us, what Australia became. Because, well, if you read David Marr, you discover that the people who took over the land and pushed the Aborigines out and all the rest of it, they weren't convicts, they were entrepreneurs who got the colonial thing and said there's these vast lands where we can go and be rich. And they were the second or third sons of wealthy people or aristocrats in Britain. And there was, they didn't want to go into the army, they didn't want to join the church, so they came to the colonies. And they were the ones who took over. The convicts, they further traumatized the convicts because there's an added bonus. You came to Australia, there were all these convicts that would work for you. So, and of course, entrepreneurism has become very basic to Australian culture. An entrepreneur can do no wrong in this country, virtually. So I think that's something we've got to face up to and be honest about too. Let's not blame the convicts for it all. And I think there are all these other people.
Convicts. I was blaming the soldiers and the governors and Macquarie.
But yeah, Macquarie wasn't traumatized.
We don't know.
No, but he was doing it for different reasons though. And I think a lot of it was to show what the people back home, look what I've done. There was a lot of power to prove themselves here.
Yeah.
Colonialism.
But he thought, I think they could create a new Britain over here.
Yeah, which was never going to work.
Which was never going to work, but they did all they could and all the brutality to try and make it work. And for them it did to a great extent.
Yeah, do we just see these people as subhuman? And we're talking about going to the moon in a minute. We're talking about going to the moon in a minute. Are we going to be creating more havoc? Like it's, how do we get out of this mess? How do we get out of this mess?
That's what David will tell us.
Well, I'm pointing. That's all. Don't have the answers. This is one important statement though. I'm trying to think of the woman's name. There's a Aboriginal woman in Queensland who says that
Attributed, yeah.
that you don't come to help us.
Help us if you want to be part of.
Yeah, because your liberation is tied up with mine.
Yeah.
And the arrogance of our culture, of our dominant culture, is that we have not seen that we need liberating. That we have not seen that there's a problem with who we are. And we have to actually get to the point where we see that and then start the journey of trying to become different people.
There's that other quote about before you approach another people, another culture, another religion, you must first take off your shoes, for the place you're approaching is holy.
That's all right, because the trauma's whole body, so shoes are only a little bit of it.
But it's similar to that Moses.
Yeah, I know.
Moses,
Yeah. Thanks, Ed.
I like the words obligation to work on our own liberation.
Yeah.
That's something that Pax Christi could do. How do we work on that?
can you go back to that previous slide you had? The,
Back one slide.
Back one, the machine's not doing as it's told. I think I keep disconnecting oh, here we are, yep.
no, not that one. That one, ah, that one,
That one?
thank you.
Just thinking of many of the spiritualities that we grew up with were really escapist spiritualities. Were not about facing the here and now. It's about, oh, look, the reward's over there. How do we come back to looking at the here and now and feeling that we can be present and responsible and journeying in the here and now?
The only thing I was going to say is that really lies at the key, as the key to the debacle of the referendum, the failure to understand the nature of colonization and the inability to recognize that. And on the part of the leadership, their failure or inability to call for that to happen. To call for that to happen.
Thank you, Joe.
I just wanted to say, I think what we're doing today is just so important, which is around education. And that's what we're doing for ourselves. And what came to mind was an Aboriginal man I've known for a long time who we sat down one day and he told me about his trauma, the trauma of his family, the trauma that he had and how he had become a perpetrator. And it was only through when he started to be educated, when he was in jail, he started to do an degree, that he started to understand what you're talking about today. Generational, way back as to what had happened. And he said all his anger just dropped out of him. Because he said, then I started to realise why I was doing or had done what I had done in the past. So I just think the more we do this kind of education to understand our histories, as Maggie's saying, is just so important. So I really want to thank you, David, for what you've given us today. And also just one other thing, now I've only just started this book, but Elizabeth Johnson has written a new book on, it's called Creation and the Cross. And the first chapter of that is going into the spirituality of what we have come out of a punishing God and how we've tried to make up for it. Have you read it?
No, I haven't, but I know what she's doing.
Yes, it's a new book that she's just come out with, and I'm fascinated with it. I've only read the first chapter of it. So, but anyway, thank you, David.
Well, you've used the word education. I think that the word that we really need to do is unlearn.
Yes.
And that's a word that's been used a number of times in the past, but there's so much that's within our subconscious that we need to bring to the surface and unlearn.
But I think what we do is draw a line on the book rather than be prepared to go back and unlearn. I just think that we're too inclined to draw a line across in history rather than be prepared to go back into history and realise that's us and realise what unlearning and what reconciliation we have to accept within ourselves.
Yep. I've had a number of years of counselling myself, and if I had have just drawn the line, there's the painful past, let me move on, there was no way I was able to move on. I had to process the stuff of the past, to see it in a new light, and then to be able to move forward. So there's no way to draw a line and think you can move on. I have to confess that's my favourite spirituality book. It's older now, it's 1980s. But just this really simple stuff, the basis of any healthy spirituality.
It is of untruth.
Yeah. Because the moment we disconnect ourselves from reality, or deny reality, or dream of something that's different from reality, we're missing the point. We're not present. We're not able to be in solidarity. We're not able to see injustices where we're contributing to them.
Thank you, David. Have you got some examples in mind when you talk about the real and the reality? And well, for me, for instance, we talk about liberation, but I'm thinking the reality is that Australia, like the rich-poor gap is getting bigger. You know, the ways that we are enslaved here in Australia, we've got to break free from, you know, like this, that's just one thing.
One of the
militarism and so forth.
Yep. One of the things in the social sciences is that often those who have benefited from injustice cannot see that they are disconnected from reality. And we have to go to those who see us better, the ones who are suffering because of the injustice we are benefiting from, and they see us better. So listening to Ray this morning, listening to Mary, reading Anne Patel Gray or any of the prolific Aboriginal academics who've actually looked at colonisation, and they say, this is what the perpetrator looks like, and these are the priorities of the perpetrator. That's the journey, that's the hard journey.
David,
Yes.
just I can call out if you like, save you running.
No. Some people did.
Okay. Just at the dinner and conversation we had on August the 9th with post-referendum, people probably know Lisa Buxton from Aboriginal Catholic Ministry. We were having a discussion about history and truth-telling and so on. And Lisa, coming out of education, seemed to think that with our history curriculum and so on, it's been like white history, and then we need to have Aboriginal history, or people, the curriculum including Aboriginal studies. And what Aboriginal students, there were some there actually from a school, there were 9 students in a school of 1,600 studying Aboriginal studies because they're just not interested, young people. And she was suggesting that if they're going to teach Australian history, that it be all one, that the Aboriginal story is part of the whole story, and teach it that way. Would that kind of thing help, do you think?
Like any teaching of history, it's all about perspective and what's your starting point and whose glasses, whose lens you're looking at history through. And if you're telling the story from the white colonist perspective, you're not telling the real story. You're only telling the story of those that have come to dominate and control. So you need to tell a story from the Aboriginal perspective, and there's more and more literature available that can help you do that in a class or an adult education context. It's all about perspective.
I guess what she was saying, though, the perspective, she was speaking as an Aboriginal person, and that Aboriginal perspective must be part of the whole of all the story, not separated.
Yeah, I wouldn't say part, I would say the fundamental building block of it, and therefore everything's seen through that.
Yep.
Because otherwise we won't know all of the harm that we've done.
Do you want to move to the next slide?
There's only one at the end after that. There's also, But this is the, you know, the basic liberation theology, feminist theology perspective is that when you're alongside the poorest, you start to see from their perspective and you start to listen and learn and hopefully you change. I liked Albert Nolan. I actually met him. I interviewed him for my doctoral thesis. So I felt very thrilled for that opportunity. But just that journey of, it's basically where you stand, where you put yourself, who you listen to, who you give priority to in your energy and your time and yeah.
I like the concept of their book. I like
Oh,
the
yes,
concept.
yes. That's that was gathered after he died, and a fellow Dominican gathered a number of his things together.
You probably don't realise it, but we've just done a group reflection, haven't we? Is that okay, Jude? We've done your reflection as a group. I'm going to call on Claude now. Finish.
I was just going to say,
Oh,
There's more to go.
there's, both Anne and I agree, but we don't necessarily agree with Nolan.
Okay.
That to feel the anger of God, we don't kind of identify with that.
Well, it depends on where you think the anger, how it's being expressed, and in some ways, anger can be one of those motivating things for change.
Yeah. No problem.
It's not about a malicious, destructive, violent expression. It's more about what's it doing to us so that we can say, hey, this is not right. We need to do something.
I really resonate very much with the anger of God, especially when you read the prophets, because I think it's their anger, God's anger coming through the prophets when they're saying this is not the way things should be, and that we can do something different. We can reimagine something and be different people and be a different people as well. So I do, you know, it doesn't have to be a violent thing, but I think more change happens through anger than through love, as we often see it. Yeah.
Representatives of anger coming through the representatives.
Are we closing up? Are we finishing?
We've got another open session later, so
We're having another session.
We're going.
No,
You might
no,
forget
it's
it, you
6
better
of them.
say it now.
Would you want to stop?
Say it, you forget it.
Well, I was just going to, I mean, but the anger of God and the prophets, that the Israelis have this claim to the whole of the land, which they based on the fact that the land was given to the chosen people in Israel and the Exodus and all that stuff. But the prophets, but it was never given unconditionally. It was they would create a just society which would be a light to the nations. And the prophets' anger, well, the prophets channeling God's anger, was because they didn't do that, and they saw that their the fact that they lost the land, as far as that was due to God's anger with them. But that is not something that they recognize, or well, I guess all their supporters anywhere else would recognize that they really haven't got any more right to the land than anybody else. So, but they haven't dealt with that. Would you agree with that's part of the trauma there?
I would rather not talk about other people's trauma. For me, I want to talk about mine and my group, because that's the one I know about. And to me, it would be stepping out of my competence to talk about other people's trauma. The most obvious thing you're saying, Harry, is the fact that the Holocaust has led to something else, has led to the need to have control over so they can look after themselves.
Things led to the Holocaust.
And all of that, yes, but yeah, I think I'd rather turn the gaze back on us and keep the gaze on us, because and hope in time other people will do their own work.
I'm going to call upon Claude now to finish up.
Something else to say, but I won't. David, thank you very much for a really powerful presentation. It's pretty challenging, and I think it's one that's going to keep us talking and reflecting and working on ourselves as well. And I really think it's important we do have that responsibility to seek our own liberation with others as well, and that sort of thing. So just a little thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Appreciate.
Thank
Thanks
you.
a lot. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks.
We now have afternoon tea, and we were meant to do groups, but I think what we did was more powerful than going into groups. But if you want to go into your groups after afternoon tea to have a talk or